Hello, so today we are going to be talking about a really important topic in our Needs Nugget. You know the drill by now. Comment if you're watching live to say hello. If you are watching on the replay, drop me a little hashtag replay. I've had a few technical issues with the Facebook Live software today, so I'm just going to give this a go and see if it works, and fingers crossed that we're okay. So today we're going to be talking about why systemic racism and other systemic inequity is relevant to the meeting of our needs. And I'm going to be giving you one small thing you can do to support yourself with dealing with the impact of these difficult issues. So if you're used to seeing my Facebook Lives, you know that normally I will ad-lib my videos and I'll just share content as it comes to me. But today I've actually got some notes here because I want to make sure that I cover off everything that needs to be included. So if my eye line keeps going down to my notes, please bear with me. Firstly, I want to start off by saying I am not an anti-racism educator. I'm not an anti-racism expert. I cover the topics of systemic privilege, systemic inequity, and how they are relevant to the meeting of our needs in the Universal Needs Programme because I have to. It's important and it's relevant to the meeting of our needs, and I'll get more to this later. I also do some work on educating on dismantling male privilege and systemic sexism. But I am somebody who is committed to my own journey of dismantling where systemic racism and other systemic inequities live inside me from having been born and raised in a culture where it is the very air that we've been breathing since the moment we were born, in order to use my privilege as a tool for changing that system. I've also made a commitment to speak up and speak out where those inequities show up and practice anti-racism and anti-other systemic inequities wherever I can. But it's really important for me to make clear here, as I said, I am not an anti-racism expert and I'm not an anti-racism educator. And if you want to know more about this, please pay those who are, especially women of colour and especially Black women, because they're able to add on those sort of layered perspectives of anti-Blackness, of intersectionality, of patriarchy and misogyny. They're so important for us to be aware of. Women like Trudy LeBron or Louisa Doran or Desiree Adaway, Nicole Lee, Rachel Ricketts, Lisa Renee Hall, Maisha T. Hill. There are many others, but these are just a few women that you should be following on these topics. But as I said, I do need to name and address where racism, systemic racism, and other systemic inequities are relevant to our needs in order for my universal needs work to be relevant and, more importantly, for it not to be harmful or weaponized. And that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. So this was always a conversation that we were going to need to have. Systemic racism is a part of our culture. We cannot get away from that. And now is the time for us to be having this conversation. In fact, it's long past the time for us to be having this conversation because, but in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and David McCarthy and all the other recent events, we cannot not have this conversation. And I want to just make a quick overview on what I'm talking about when I mean when I talk about systemic racism and systemic inequities. So how a lot of people tend to think about racism is about individual bad people doing intentionally bad things because of their race or the race of another person. Whereas what I tend to focus on is that the bigger issue is systemic racism. And systemic racism is a massive issue in our society because it's a systemic inequity which gives benefits and advantages to those who are white and systemically penalises and costs those who are not. So people who hold systemic racial privilege find it incredibly hard to see and recognise systemic racism because the impacts of systemic privilege sit in the blind spots of those who hold privilege, blind spots that we are not taught to look for. I've been doing this work for years now, and there are still occasions where it could be happening right in front of me and I still don't see it. So sometimes I use another example of systemic inequity in order for us to help understand a little bit. And the one that most people tend to be able to relate to because it's a little bit more easy to see in some cases is being able-bodied versus physically disabled. So if you're able-bodied, your life doesn't necessarily mean that your life is easy, but because our society is set up in a way which considers able-bodied being the norm, what it means is it's easier than somebody who maybe doesn't have the same level of access or opportunity due to a physical disability. So for example, wheelchair access or bias in hiring, those kind of things. So there are actually less barriers for somebody who is able-bodied than for somebody who is disabled. So systemic racism is a similar pattern of systemic inequity and oppression, and it's everywhere and it affects everything. Just look for who is represented and who is not, and how they are represented on the majority of TV shows, in films, in magazines, in books. It affects housing, it affects education, it affects finances, it affects healthcare, it affects the criminal justice system, the workplace, hiring practices, politics, the list goes on and on and on. And you just have to look at the disproportionate effect that the coronavirus has had on Black, Indigenous, Asian, and other communities of colour to see systemic racism in action. So the other thing I want to make a quick note of is that systemic racism can be active or passive, or it can be overt or covert. So when I'm talking about active or passive, there was an amazing Facebook post by a gentleman called Jackie Summers last year who talked about the difference between active and passive. And there's been a recent visual that's just been sent out by a Facebook page called The Conscious Kid, talking about the difference between overt and covert. So let's look at the difference. So making a racist joke, for example, would be active or overt racism. But not saying something when somebody else makes a racist joke is that passive covert systemic racism. And the passive slash covert is what actually creates an environment in which the active and overt is allowed to happen. Now, I also want to make sure that I'm being clear here that this is not just about systemic racism, that is about all other systemic inequities. So it's about people being systemically penalised in our culture and in our society for being other than the arbitrary societal norm. So this includes being systemically crossed for being part of the LGBTQIA+ community, including not being cisgendered, for your gender or gender identity, for being physically disabled, for having mental health issues, for having chronic illness, for being lower class, for belonging to a certain religion, for not having educational privilege, for being too old or too young, for being considered fat or not pretty by cultural standards. There are a multitude of ways in which people are marginalised in our culture. They are all absolutely relevant and they all operate in patterns. And they're all relevant when it comes to the meeting of our needs. And then the other thing I want to say is that I've been seeing a lot of people here in the UK and in other countries talking about how bad it is over there in America. And this is one of the ways that systemic racism keeps itself hidden and protected, making it about over there, not about my country, not about my community, not about me. And this is very as much a part of our society here as it is theirs. It just manifests differently there. But make no mistake, it is just as lethal and damaging and harmful here in this country. And the thing is that because systemic inequity is the air that we've been living and breathing since the moment we were born, these systems have been absorbed by us all. They live inside us. Having patterns of systemic inequity inside you doesn't make you inherently a bad person. It means that you're a human who has been conditioned by our culture, because we all have been. Once you become aware of that fact, your choice to either seek it out and dismantle it or leave it to continue harming other people is the real test of your moral character. Because we might not have been responsible for creating the system, but we do benefit from it. So it's our responsibility to seek out the places it lives inside us and dismantle them, so we do not unintentionally and inadvertently do harm to others or are complicit in the system. And we can then use the privilege that we have to be a part of changing the system. So I can hear people saying, well, what does this have to do with needs? Well, you see, it has everything to do with the meeting of our needs, because we are not all on an even playing field when it comes to meeting our needs. The extent to which someone is affected by systemic inequity is the extent to which they have more barriers to overcome to get their needs met. So let's look at an example. So if, for example, you're someone who has been systemically told by society that you have less value by not being shown on TV or in movies, by not getting the jobs, by not being in the C-suites of companies or in government, etc., you have so much further to go, so many more barriers to overcome in order to get your value need met, the value that links to our sense of self-worth met. So there are innumerable, and that's just one example of how this systemic inequity ties into the meeting of our needs and just how uneven the playing field is and how many more barriers there are to overcome to get our basic needs met. What it also means is that where we hold systemic privilege, we have a responsibility to use the privilege that we have to counterbalance our societal inequity and change the system to create equity in the future. So, for example, where I have been living in a culture which systemically prioritises my feelings and comfort, when I'm engaging with somebody who doesn't hold the same privileges that I do, I make the effort to consistently prioritise theirs. Now, this is not sacrificing my needs. This is recognising the arbitrary benefits and advantages that the system has given me with respect to meeting my needs, and it's using them to make things more equitable. And we need to remember that our needs are interconnected to the needs of others around us. This is something as a society we've got really disconnected with and we seem to have forgotten. And if my needs get met in ways that harm others, it actually negatively impacts my needs as well, often without us even realizing. It happens at a subconscious level. It erodes our kind of different sometimes needs, but it will erode our needs from being met as well. And in my experience, while the landscape for meeting our needs is different for different people who have or don't have certain privileges, systemic privileges, there is still more that we can all learn to do for ourselves to ensure our needs are better met, even in the current social climate, in fact, especially in it. And this doesn't negate in any way the need for the system's change. All it does, it means that we can stay better resourced in the meantime. So the other thing with it, where how this is relevant to needs, is that in my experience, learning how to effectively meet our own needs is one of the things that will support us in navigating through and supporting us in dealing with these issues. So as someone who's been involved in dismantling where the systems of privilege live inside me, both in the places where I hold privilege, things like being white, being cisgender, being straight, being able-bodied, etc., and where I don't hold it, for example, with being a woman, I've been able to see how the effective meeting of needs is supportive to both sides of the work. And I've also had this reflected to me from people who've been through the universal needs work. So where you hold privilege, when you're dismantling privilege, when you're dismantling places where you hold systemic privilege, there is often, in my experience, a pattern that shows up that looks something like this. You start off beginning to do the work of facing these systems and how they affect others in the world. You then get overwhelmed by guilt, shame, anger, grief, discomfort, or any other emotion. You then get to the stage of paralysis, of being unable to function with that intensity of emotion because we are not used to dealing with it, because we're not used to facing these issues where we hold the privilege. And then what we do is we check out of the work in order to recover from it. What we don't realise is that when we check out, that is in itself retreating into and benefiting from our privilege, because we can check out, because it's not affecting us all the time. And then what happens is when we've recovered, we then re-engage with the work of facing the systems, and the cycle starts again, and we just go around that circle numerous times. Now, during the first course I did on dismantling white privilege, the facilitator asked me what I could do to increase my capacity to be with the discomfort of doing this work. So in order that I could stay in the work, not retreat into my privilege by checking out, so that I could actually increase my capacity to do the work, and also my capacity to be effective when being a part of changing these systems in the wider world. And I discovered that learning how to effectively meet my own needs was the most powerful way I had found to be able to increase this capacity, and therefore my resilience and effectiveness in anti-racism and anti-other systemic inequity work, both within myself and in the wider world. It was the thing that gave me what I needed to be able to increase my capacity to be with that discomfort and still stay engaged with the work so I could stay effective. Now, in the spaces where you do not hold privilege, when I was dismantling the places where I did and do not hold systemic privilege, for example, when I was beginning to dismantle how I'd internalized the system of patriarchy and how it affected my life, my choices, my actions and behaviors, I found that first and foremost, learning how to effectively meet my own needs gave me more of the internal resources to simply cope with living in an unjust and equitable system. And what I discovered was, in a society that is systemically designed to make it harder for certain people and groups to get their needs adequately met, learning to effectively meet your own needs is actually a radical act of resistance against that system. And as an anti-racism educator, Bitsy Lee Lewis, once said to me, skillful means for needs meeting is a revolutionary responsibility. What it did was it gave me the resilience to be able to recover quickly, more quickly or quicker when that system impacted me, and it gave me the internal resources to be able to be effective in beginning to change that system. So, for example, in my work teaching about dismantling male privilege, so what I found was that there was this link between needs and the ability to show up in this work, whether it was being able to recognize how my privilege affects my ability to meet my needs and how it affects others' ability to meet their needs, and where my responsibilities sit within that system because of the privilege I hold, and also how it enabled me to stay within the really challenging work of dismantling that privilege, and also to support myself in the areas where I didn't have it. So there's one small thing that I've discovered so far that you can do to support yourself with dealing with and recovering from the impact of these really difficult issues. So when I first began doing my work on dismantling white privilege, I learned about the importance of supporting the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve, vagus originates from the term wanderer, and the vagus nerve originates from the brainstem, and it's wandering all its way down through the body into the belly, spreading fibers into the tongue, the pharynx, the vocal cords, the lungs, the heart, the stomach, the intestines, and glands that produce all the anti-stress enzymes and hormones, the ones that influence like digestion, metabolism, and the relaxation response. And what I found was that discovered was that stimulating and toning the vagus nerve, it triggers a signal in your system which slows your heart rate, it decreases your blood pressure, it decreases cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and it induces feelings of calm. What it also does, though, is it increases your capacity to deal with pressure and your resilience to stress. It helps you to recover from stress more quickly, and it activates the parasympathetic system, which is responsible for rest and digest. So lots of ways of doing this, but one I found particularly helpful is something called Vue Breathing. So I learned about it when I was dismantling white privilege as a way to increase my capacity to do the work and be more effective in it. But I've also seen Jennifer Sterling of the Bodyful Healing organisation, which is an organisation that offers dance/movement psychotherapy and depression support for Black women, share it as a technique to support with the following. This is a quote from her. I truly believe it is a big part of the healing process for people of colour, that a big part of the healing process for people of colour is self-regulation, creating space for our bodies to come into balance and recover from the stress and strain of living in a society where we are oppressed and marginalised on a daily basis. These periods of recovery foster resilience and increase vitality. So it was another indicator that here was a technique that was supportive where we were dismantling privilege that we had and also where we don't. So the basic idea of Vue Breathing is there are a few steps to go through. So you start off by sitting as comfortably as you can. You feel the support of the ground, the chair, the bed, whatever it is that's underneath you. And you relax as much as you feel able to do in that moment. And then what you do is you take a very deep belly breath. So you should notice your belly expand. Your shoulders shouldn't move too much at all when this is happening. And once you've breathed in, what you're going to do is breathe out, making a very deep Vue sound for 3 counts, or as long as is comfortably possible. So it sounds something like this. So you take a deep breath in. And what you want to try and do, if you can, is to aim the sound at your belly and chest so that you, if you can, feel the vibrations in your chest, your body, your arms, even your legs if you can. And then what you do is you repeat the breath and that Vue sound for 3 to 5 minutes, or as long as you're enjoying it. And obviously, if you feel you need to stop before 3 minutes, please do so. And then whenever you feel you want to stop, just let go of the deep breath and the Vue sound and simply return to your normal breathing pattern. And then just take a moment to ensure that you feel comfortable before moving, because obviously we want to, sometimes when you do breath work, we might feel a little lightheaded, we're having more oxygen in our system than we're used to. So we just want to make sure that we feel comfortable before we start moving. So that's one small technique that you can use to support yourself with dealing with and recovering from the impact of these difficult issues, whether you hold systemic privilege or not. So this is a topic that is not going away. It has never been away. It has always been there underneath the surface. It is only just for some of us now coming into our awareness. As I said, I've been studying and researching this work for several years now, and it's interesting to me to see now there's more awareness coming up. People are asking questions about it. What can we do? And I'm realizing that this is something that has always been there, and it needs to be addressed for everybody's benefit, but especially for the sake of those people who are literally losing their lives as a result of it. So we're going to be going into this in more detail in the Nourish Your Needs community today. So if you're a woman who would like to explore this further, please feel free to join us over there. And as I started off by saying, I'm not an expert or educator in anti-racism, and I'm still on a learning journey myself. So if there are any folks watching from marginalised groups or people who have also studied, researched, and are doing their work on this piece, who want to provide me with feedback, who can see anywhere that I'm causing harm or anywhere I can do better, I am wide open to that feedback as well. And going forward, I'm going to be sharing more resources on how to support yourself, both in meeting your needs, in order that you can be better supported in the future, both with these difficult issues and with the other aspects of your life too. So if you want to, please do feel free to come back and get more information. But this is a really important topic. It matters to all of us. It is affecting our entire society, and those of us who hold more systemic privilege have a responsibility. As I said, we may not have set it up, we may not have created the system, but we have benefited from it, and we have more of the social power because of it to do something about it. So we need to be effective in using that privilege, in learning about privilege, in learning how it shows up in our lives, in learning the ways in which it's present and how we can start to dismantle it within ourselves, and also be a part of changing these systems in the wider world, because the world needs to change, and this is something that is long overdue. So I invite you to join me on this journey. If there are any if you'd like any resources, if you'd like me to direct you in the direction of any of the educators who I've mentioned, and or other resources, then please feel free to reach out and ask. I'm here to help, and I look forward to seeing you again really soon. Much love.